that, I will start to introduce the first speaker, Torfi Tulinius, who is a professor in the Department of Icelandic and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Iceland. And Torfi has published widely about medieval literature, often with an interest in theories of literature, psychology, and semiotics. And trauma, as Yoav already has mentioned, has been one of the many topics that Torfi has treated. As Yoav already said, this topic of trauma has been introduced by Torfi. And today, another major topic of Torfi's will be part of the lecture, I think, namely one of the sagas of Icelanders, on which Torfi has published extensively, Egil saga. Obsessively. Yes, we are looking forward in any way. And I won't make a long introduction since we are here in an informal gathering. So I just want to say that it's very, very nice to have Torfi here. Torfi is a dear friend of mine and a good colleague, and we have very often met in Iceland. And it's so nice to have you here in Aarhus. So thank you to you for making that happen. So please come to.
So I guess I'll sit so the camera can see me. So hello everybody, hello to old friends and new friends, and it's and also online. There are old friends and new friends online as well. So it's I'm very happy to be here. The topic of trauma is really, really very interesting, and especially in its relationship to literature, because as Yoav was saying, trauma is an event, but it is an event which reverberates and continues. And in many ways, the trauma, in some theories at least, does not become real until it is repeated. And that's when it becomes the subject who has undergone a trauma becomes aware, maybe not of the trauma, but of its effects on the person. And one of the effects is how that person expresses herself or himself. And this expression is particularly, I think, interesting in literature. And some works of literature are very much involved in repeating the trauma or echoing the trauma. And I think it's really rewarding to try to understand how the trauma reverberates in literary works. So what I'm going to be doing now is repeating my long time involvement with Egil saga. And I'll be focusing especially on the poem, the most famous poem contained in Egil saga, Sonatorrek, on the irreparable loss of sons. And I'll be looking at it from the point of view of, well, I'll bring in psychoanalysis. I know that many people are very skeptical of psychoanalysis. For me, it works. And especially when you are listening to what is happening in works of literature. You have mentioned the problem of applying psychoanalysis to pre-Freudian cultures. I think it's even more relevant in pre-Freudian culture because you don't have the kind of complication of trying to understand how the subject aware of Freudian theories is kind of hiding behind it, or how that complicates his or her expression. So I think that psychoanalysis, using psychoanalysis to understand medieval works of art, which I do, is well, methodologically viable. So what semiotics and Sonatorrek, what happens in the bed closet. Because Yoav loves comics, my starting point will be. No, how do I do this? Here it is. Okay, here it is. Yeah. Okay. This is one of my favorite comic characters, Charlie Brown and Snoopy. And Charlie Brown's favorite expression is "good grief." And good grief is a very strange expression when you think of it. Good grief. And it only appears in the middle of the 20th century. At least that's what the American Heritage Dictionary tells us. And it's probably a way not to say, not to be blasphemous and say, good God. And it only became popular with these comic strips of Peanuts. It's, in a way, it's Charlie Brown's, the internal depressive, the little 7-year-old or 6-year-old or 9-year-old depressive. He is always saying this, good grief. But how can grief be good? Is that something to think of? And I think of it in terms of what Sigmund Freud, in his groundbreaking essay on mourning and melancholia. In Mourning and Melancholia, he describes the difference between grieving, on one hand, grieving which is normal, the normal grieving over the loss of someone you love or the loss of something you love or something important to you. You progressively, after you have lost that love object, whatever it is, a person close to you or whatever, retiring, for example, and losing your job, you progressively replace the lost object with a new one, and the object remains in your psyche, but it has found the lost object. It is found another place, and this is kind of what Freud says is healthy grieving. So it is good grief. So the expression makes sense in that respect. But then there are other ways of grieving, and sometimes there is an inability to grieve, or the grief turns into depression, chronic depression. And Freud says that this has to do with an unresolved aggressivity towards the lost object. The lost object there's ambiguous feelings towards the lost object. There's some unconscious, very often, a feeling of hatred or aggressivity towards the object, which makes it impossible to grieve. And this is an important moment in the evolution of Freudian psychoanalysis, because it is he is preparing a revision of his theories. He was very heavily influenced by the terrible things that happened during World War I, and his sons were in danger. They were participated in the war. He was treating severely traumatized soldiers who suffered from what was called shell shock in that time, and this precedes the introduction in his theory of the idea of the death drive, so that there are two sets of drives, Eros and Thanatos, as they were called later, the life drives that keep together and control the death drives, which are part of our aggressivity and yearning for destruction and return to the quiescence of non-organic life, as Freud said. I'll come back to that later. But anyway, this type of grief that transforms into melancholia or depression is an example of a bad grief. And to go to the Middle Ages and Iceland in the Middle Ages, well, revenge was a way to grieve healthily, one could say. And here I borrowed, of course, one of Yoav's Vikings, who is involved in a type of good grieving, because in this honor-based society, where with the lack of central power to maintain peace, the obligation to avenge is a way to regulate society, but is also a way to provide emotional outlet for grief. And you can note the blood on the axe of this is a grieving process, and this is not just the stuff of comic books. We see this in Sturlunga Saga, the saga of the Sturlungs, one of the contemporary sagas, which tells of real events that actually happened. Of course, they are shaped by the narrator in literary ways, and especially maybe this event, which is one of the most memorable descriptions of the Sturlunga Saga, the attack and the burning down of the farm of Flugumýri in northern Iceland, the farm belonging to Gissur Thorvaldsson, who is a major chieftain, who will later become Earl of Iceland 5 years later. He is attacked in the farm by followers of Sturla Sighvatsson, whom Gissur had killed himself with his hands, or with his axe or sword, I don't remember, in 1238, 15 years earlier. They attack the farm is burned down. Gissur escapes miraculously, but his wife and his 3 sons are killed. And the saga stages Gissur witnessing the carrying out of the burnt corpses of his loved ones that he sees. So that must have a very traumatic experience indeed. But Gissur is stopped in his resolve to avenge his family. His whole family has been wiped out. He needs to avenge them. He needs to emotionally to avenge them, but also politically, because he is in danger of being wiped out as a political actor. He doesn't have any sons to inherit his power. He has been weakened, and to avenge is a way of recovering his lost position. But the bishop of the region imposes truce. And that is when Gissur starts to communicate through the Twitter of the time, the skaldic stanza, and communicates about his grief. And he said, and I'm going to read it just because I love the sound of Drottqvart, and also to give you a sense of the drama in this skaldic stanza. En mank böl það sprunnu, bauga hlín og mínir, skaði kennir mér minni minn, 3 synir inni, glaður munat göndlar röðla gnýskerðandi verða, brjótur lifir sjá við sútir sverðs, nema hefndir verði. Now what is Gissur saying here? I still remember the misery when my wife and 3 sons were burned inside. My loss teaches me to remember. And here Gissur is actually quoting Cicero. And then he says, the warrior will not be glad, that is, himself, will not be glad unless revenge is done. The sword breaker lives in sorrow. So what is he saying here? He will live in sorrow until revenge has been done. So he wants to grieve. He is grieving, but an outlet for his grief will be revenge. And despite the ban or the truce imposed by the bishop, Gissur goes on and goes on an expedition and hunts down members of the group that attacked him, and he kills 7 of them, and he's not happy until he has killed the 7th one, who is a member of the Sturlung family, and an important chieftain. Kolbeinn is his name. And after that, he sends out another Twitter in the form of a skaldic stanza, and here it is. Borg lét brennu varga, bjór stofnandi klofna, sónar sex og einum, sák deili þess heila. Bergstjóra gleður báru, blik stríðanda síðan hregg, en hafnag muggu heldur, sís Kolbeinn feldum. So he says the poet himself had the skulls of the burners cleft open. I saw it. So it's interesting. This skaldic poetry is such an interesting medium, not in so many ways, and one of it is the kind of how the subject is. The poet can refer to himself both in the first and the third person in the same stanza. So it's a kind of interesting for postmodern theorists of the dispersion of the subject. That was a digression. Poetry cheers up the warrior. Since Kolbeinn was slain, I refuse sadness. And hafnag muggu heldur. So now he, in the first, what's one of the interesting things about these stanzas from the middle of the 13th century are that they express personal emotion. And there he says, I am depressed, I'm sad. And also that, and in a way, if this is a public event, if he's publicly, this is a public display of emotions. And we have to think of that in the context of his relationship with the bishop, who wants to stop the violence. He is kind of guaranteeing public sympathy for his actions, I think, against the bishop. But at the same time, I think it's also quite sincere that he actually feels better after having had 7 men killed. And, you can understand that. If I mean, his whole family was wiped out, and what in light of Freud's theories on good grief and bad grief, and also in the light of more modern theories of resilience, it's really interesting to see, and it's interesting that the author of this account, Sturla Þórðarson, is himself interested in the behavior of Gissur. He's interested in the way Gissur reacts to this very traumatic experience, and he makes a point of telling us that after the revenge, Gissur goes and rides to the west to Geitaskard in Langidalur, and where he probably already has his eye on a very beautiful young woman, and he goes there, takes the concubine, and we're told that he soon loves her greatly. So this is really an example of good grief in Freud's sense. That is to say, he replaces the lost object with a new one, and so this is a kind of the context of the mid-13th century that tells us that revenge is a way to grieve, but it is also a society which tries to regulate violence in other ways, for example, by monetary compensation. And this is often done to avoid continued violence. Compensation could be paid. So here you see Riki observing a bag of gold. But some did not find it a satisfying replacement for the lost object. And Njáls gives us a very good example of that. Höskuldur Þráinsson has been murdered by the sons of Njáll, by Skarphéðinn and his brothers. And Hildigunnur wants revenge. There's this very long staging of the ritual of Hildigunnur's behavior in order to coerce her uncle Flosi into obtaining blood revenge. She wants blood for her husband's blood, but he wants to make peace in an honorable way, which means receiving compensation. And he resists her invectives, one could say. And what she says to him is, if you want to be a man, then you have to avenge my husband. And he turns blue and black and green in the face, but resists this, or he seems to resist it. But then when at the parliament, at Alþingi, when compensation has been agreed upon, and it's a threefold compensation for Höskuldur, the highest ever paid for the death of one man in Iceland, the saga tells us. Flosi suddenly loses control when Njáll puts feminine or feminine-like clothing items on top of the pile of gold or silver that is going to be paid for the compensation. And Flosi loses control, starts insulting Njáll, and his loss of control, you can interpret it in the terms of psychoanalysis. There's this term of the big other, which is kind of the ideology which surrounds us, which we have to compare ourselves with. And Flosi cannot stand it's actually the taunting, the invectives of Hildigunnur, which come back to him. He loses control, and that leads to the tragedy of the burning of the farm of Njáll. So there's this hesitation between good grief and bad. So there's this longing for violence to be unleashed. And so let's go to Egill and the Egill saga. Now, what happens to Egill after the drowning of his son Böðvar? This is in chapter 78 of the saga, which contains 90 chapters, or 90, 89, 88, depending on the editions. So this is close to the end of the saga, and one of Egill's sons has been drowned by a storm, and this is Egill is already mature. His children are growing up. One of his daughters is already married. His foster daughter as well. This son is much loved by him, but he also has two other sons, and as well as two daughters and a stepdaughter. When Böðvar drowns, he's caught in a storm, and he drowns on the fjord. Egill goes and retrieves his body and puts it in his father's grave mound. And this is a sculpture that you can see that is displayed in Borgarnes, where Skallagrim's grave mound is still on display. And Egill is described as almost, his grief is so huge that he bursts. He swells up, and his clothes burst at their seams. And after having put his son into his father's grave mound and having closed it again, he goes into his bed closet, lokarekkja, with the intention of starving himself to death. So he cannot and will not get over this. Even if he has plenty of other objects to love, he still has one son, for example. But he has reason to live, but does not want to live anymore. Now, why is he grieving? Why is he so grief-stricken by the loss of this one? What explains Egill's reaction? We're told in the saga, in the prose, that he had previously, another of his sons, Gunnar, had died of illness. Böðvar is caught in this storm. And if you look at the map, you can see that where the town of Borgarnes is where the grave mound of Skallagrimur is said. There is a grave mound there, and it's said to be actually, but the saga tells us that this is the grave mound of Skallagrimur, who is Egill's father. And the wind, we're told specifically that this is a southwesterly wind, which means that the wind is blowing from, and that Bölvar is near the bottom of the fjord, so he's to the northeast. So the wind is blowing from the mound. This is not said specifically, but we are told that it is a southwesterly wind. Now, I ask myself, is this relevant? Is this an indication of some kind of agency of the dead Skallagrímur in the drowning of the young boy? And I have reason to believe that. First of all, there is a long history of violence between father and son in Egil Saga. Skallagrímur, when Egil is when Egil is 7, he kills his first man, with a boy who had treated him badly in games. And speaking of pre-Freudian innocence, the saga tells us that the name of that little boy was Grímur, which is the same name as Egil's father. But the violence is real between the two. When Egil is 11, he and his friend are wrestling with Skallagrímur, and the Skallagrímur loses control and kills Egil's best friend, Þórður, and he's about to kill Egil. His rage turns against Egil when Brák, Þorgerður Brák, Egil's nanny or wet nurse, deflects the rage of Skallagrímur on herself, and Skallagrímur kills Brák. So two people who are very dear to Egil have been killed by his father, and Egil retaliates, and he was almost killed himself by his father. So, and Egil retaliates by, in that very same evening, killing Skallagrímur's foreman, whom he cherished the most, the saga tells us. So there's a barely suppressed aggressivity in the father-son relationship. Now remember what I was telling you about aggressivity and the lost object, and the inability to grieve the object for whom you feel you have aggressive feelings. Now, but Skallagrímur is dead. He lies in his grave mound. But then you have to go into the kind of wider literary context, in the context of folk belief in the time of writing of the sagas. And another saga, Eyrbyggja saga, which is written about the same time as Egil saga, possibly before, more likely afterwards, has shared elements of the. There is also a father who dies, but comes back as a revenant. So in Eyrbyggja saga, an angry father, Þórólfur Bægifótur, who is angry at his son, dies sitting in his high seat with his eyes open, just like Skallagrímur. And Skallagrímur has a conversation with his son, Egil. He says to Egil, what about I'm assuming that most people know the saga very well, but just for those who don't, Egil had an older brother, Þórólfur. The two of them fight as mercenaries in England. Þórólfur is killed in a battle, and the king of Athelstan of England gives 2 chests of silver to Egil in compensation for his brother, but he says specifically that one of them should go to his father, Skallagrímur. But many years pass, and Skallagrímur and Egil have a conversation. Skallagrímur says, what about that silver that you were supposed to pay me from the king Athelstan? And Egil says, well, you don't need any silver. You still have a lot of silver. And so he hasn't paid him. So Skallagrímur has not received compensation for the son he lost in the battle in England. So, and immediately after that conversation, Skallagrímur dies with his eyes open, sitting in his high seat, just like the character Þórólfur bæjarfótur in Eyrbyggjasaga. And just like the son Arnkell in Eyrbyggjasaga, Egill avoids the gaze of the dead father and takes him out of the building by making a hole in the wall, and in order to avoid the dead person coming back as a revenant. And but in Eyrbyggjasaga, the dead father comes back to haunt the valley, and the grave is opened. He even kills his wife, the revenant, and the grave is open to lay his victim in there. So there are shared elements. Böðvar is laid in Skallagrim's grave, but there are also differences. Skallagrimur does not, the sagas does not tell us that Skallagrimur comes back from the dead. But does he? Does he come back from the dead in the form of weather magic? This is something that what do you call it? The supernatural or paranormal triggering of extreme weather events, as we're calling them nowadays, is something that we see very often in the sagas. And I think that the author of Egil's is suggesting that Skallagrimur's anger for having not received any compensation for his dead son is now directed against Egill. And so in this case, Egill is, Böðvar is, the son of Egill, is Skallagrimur's victim. So why was Skallagrimur angry at Egill? This is a picture of his grave mound. So I've already told this. And what does Skallagrimur do before he dies, sitting upright on his high seat with his eyes open? He takes his horse, takes a chest of silver of his own, and a kettle, ketil, a copper kettle, and he goes and buries it in a marsh or in a kelda, and and puts a big stone on top of it, and nobody has found it before. And this is very strange. So it's not strange that Skallagrimur is angry at his son for not giving him silver. So before he dies, he takes his own silver and buries it so his son won't get it after his death. But why the copper kettle? Why the copper kettle? That doesn't make any sense. And unless you think of the words, ketil. And in my analysis of Egil's saga, which I don't have time to go into here, I point to the fact that there are very many characters called ketil in Egil's saga, and they appear at strategic points, and they have bynames, which are related to theological concepts, but also to the Old Norse mythology. Höður, the blind god who kills his brother. And I think the message and so Ketil with an additional word is a carrier of meaning in this this saga, which is a highly literary work of art. And Eir means mercy. So what is Skallagrimur saying before he dies, with his eyes open in a very scary way? He is saying there will be no mercy, and Eir's son will not be spared. But that doesn't happen until many, many years later. But this is my theory. So it's impossible for Egill to avenge Böðvar. He cannot, so as he says in the poem, Sonatorrek, you cannot take revenge on the ocean. And that, of course, is the ocean storm which has killed Böðvar. But if Skallagrimur is responsible, as it is possible to read out from the saga, then you cannot take revenge on a person who is already dead. And so even the anger you feel against the dead person is, you cannot, there's no outlet for that. So instead of killing Skallagrímur, he is killing himself by starving himself to. So this is of course, bad grief, the impossible anger directed at the lost object. Now, the saga, Egil saga, as I was saying just a few moments ago, is a very intricate and well-constructed, original, unique work of art, composed by somebody who was well versed in skaldic poetry, and managed to use what I call the skaldic mindset to compose this work, which I think is much more fictional than based on, or let's say we could say it is a very creative way. It is based on oral tradition in a very creative and original way. And Egil's paternal grandfather also lost a son, the first Þórólfur, and he also goes to bed and wants to die. And he mourns him, and he also composes one stanza, the first stanza in the saga. So mourning, mourning introduces poetry into the saga, which I think is important. And the first skaldic stanza of 60 in the saga is Egil's paternal grandfather, Kveld-Úlfur, complaining about his inability to avenge his son because of his old age. So, but finally, his son, Skallagrímur, tells him to get up, and they find two young princes, cousins of King Harald, and they kill them, and also the emissaries of the king who had participated in the killing of Þórólfur. And in that sense, revenge allays grief. But it's really interesting that the drowning of promising young men run in the family. There are so many repetitions, structural repetitions in the saga. So Kveld-Úlfur and Skallagrímur drown the two young princes. Böðvar is drowned also at sea. And what does Egil do when he is so angry at King Eric, Blood Axe, and Queen Gunhild? He attacks their son, the 12-year-old Rögnvaldur, who is sailing on a ship with 12 companions, and he was a very promising young man, and he is drowned by Egil. So this theme of drowning promising young men is something that is repeated, and repetition is also meaning. You make meaning by repeating something and changing a detail. And I think that this conflict between father and son in the saga underlies the whole saga of Egil. And and it is impossible. It's an impossible conflict, especially if the father is dead. And so we have Egil lying in his bed closet and waiting to die. And his grown-up daughter, hears of this, and on the morning of the third day, she is sent for. I think that is a biblical allusion, but she enters the bed closet with her father, and the author takes pains to tell us that in the bed closet there were actually two beds. So he is telling us that they're not sharing a bed, which I think is, denying, but at the same time acknowledging its possibility was that of incest, father and daughter in the same bed. But she tricks her father into drinking milk, and it's very obvious that she's tricking him. And she actually has the same name. He has given his oldest daughter the name not of his mother, Sion, but of his wet-nurse, Þorgerður Brák, the very same person who had given her life to save him. And once that he has drunk the milk and becomes so enraged that he bites a So he swallows the drink. It's in a horn, a drinking horn, so he can't see what he is drinking. He swallows it in one gulp, and then when he realizes what has happened, he bites the horn and throws it away. So rage comes up through the depression. And so she suggests that he compose that, well, they won't die right away since they have drunk milk. And she suggests that he compose poetry instead of dying right away. And then she says, then we'll die later, if that's what we feel like. Síðan deyjum við ef okkur sýnist. And there's the Egil Saga has this kind of veiled humor, or ironic humor always underlying. Now, the role of poetry in this saga, I think, is really important. And it's staged very interesting. So I said that the first poem is about mourning, but Egil enters the stage as a poet in a very transgressive situation. When, as a 3-year-old, he goes to a feast his father has forbidden him to go to, and and this is probably an intertextual reference to the legendary saga Heiðrek saga, where Heiðrekur, the younger brother of two, so Egil's older brother has been invited to the feast, and Egil has been invited, but his father says, no, you behave too badly, and if you get drunk, you'll behave even worse. So say that to a 3-year-old. This is a likely intertextual reference to the legendary saga of Heiðrek. Heiðrekur is a young boy. His older brother is invited to a feast, but not the father doesn't allow Heiðrekur to go. He goes anyway, and he makes trouble and then throws a stone in the dark and kills his older brother. But Egil does not kill his older brother, at least not in this scene, or not in this sense, but instead he produces poetry. His first poems as a 3-year-old, 2 stanzas, and is rewarded for that by his maternal grandfather. And and then comes a statement about Egil. Vel lagði Egil í þökk skáldskap sinn við marga menn. So Egil many people were gratified by or grateful to Egil for his poetry. And the first was his maternal grandfather. So there's an association here between poetry and femininity, the mother's side. And think of Þorgerður cajoling his father to produce poetry, but also in relationship with the father, escaping or defying the law of the father, the authority of the father, through poetry, or poetry makes it possible. So let's look at this poem, Sonatorrek, he composes. I translated the irreparable loss of the sons. And it's badly preserved. It's only preserved in one of the medieval, not even a medieval manuscript, it's preserved in a copy of a lost medieval manuscript. And there are many difficulties in interpreting it, probably because of it was not a very good copy. And there's a huge divergence, but there's a lot of diverging opinions about its age. Many people believe very strongly, based on linguistic evidence, and also because of its contents, they want to see it as a poem authentically composed by the pagan Egil in the 10th century. Other scholars have seen influence from Christian poetry, but Old English poetry. There's a recent article by Sian Grundley, a professor in Oxford, about that. Myself, I believe that there's quite a chance that it was composed by the saga author. And because some people see contradictions between the poem and the saga. I do not. I think that the poem fits very well into the saga, and it fits quite well into my reading of the saga, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But just here, a synopsis of the poem. It's a long poem and has 23 stanzas. Mjög trekt tungu að træræður loftvætt, ljóðpundara að vænlegt á viðris þýfi, nú vænlegt á viðris þýfi, né hógdrækt úr hugar fylsni. That is the first stanza, so it's difficult to compose. That's how it starts, about the difficulty of composing poetry and the difficulty of grieving, and there's even the suggestion of sobbing, ekki. And the first 4 stanzas are about this difficulty of grieving and composing poetry but then he starts and he begins by a short stanza evoking the death of his mother and father, and then a series of stanzas where he laments his dead son and expresses the desire to avenge him by battling the sea. But of course, that is impossible. He's too old, and like his grandfather, so that echoes his grandfather's stanza. And then he laments the loss of his brother. And then he says, he who takes money for his brother's death is to be condemned. That's something that he had actually done. Himself, he had been compensated for the death of his brother, and he kept the money for himself. That's what the conflict with Skallagrimur is about. And then there's this very interesting thing. There's an incomplete stanza. I find when somebody asks me for money, and then there's a blank. And so which could be a reference to Skallagrimur, but we don't know about that one. And then he goes on and he says that you can replace the lost son by engendering another one. And then he goes into lamenting the other son, Gunnar, who had been taken by illness. And then he addresses Odin and says that he mentions Odin, the god Odin, who is the god of war, but also the god of poetry, and says that he was good friends with Odin, but their friendship was terminated. And nevertheless, Odin gave him something which is compensation for loss, which is poetry. And he says, I do not sacrifice to Odin because I want to, but instead I await death with goodwill and without sorrow. Skalk heljar bíða glaður með góðan vilja. So this is the poem. There are many details in the poem which are difficult to interpret, and so on, partly because of the bad manuscript transmission. So he's awaiting death with goodwill. That's how the poem ends. And there are several elements which suggest that the author of the poem was acquainted with the Christian religion, whether it was in the 10th century or the 12th or the 13th. The fact that he does not sacrifice willingly to Odin, that he is a pagan who is practicing poetry, which comes from Odin, but maybe not because he wants to. He might be a suggestion that he is what was called a noble pagan, a reluctant pagan. The fact that he wants to fight the sea, which is a reference to the Persian Emperor Xerxes, who tried to fight the sea. And then in the 5th stanza, just after he speaks of his mother and his father, there's this reference to an account from the Old Testament, Numbers 17. It's this stanza, "Það berg úr orðhofi, marðar timbur máli laufgað." I carry out of the temple of words the timber of praise that has been made to bear leaves by language. And this has a relationship with an account from the Bible. The tribes of Israel are arguing over who is going to be the arch priest, and Moses speaks to God, or Yahweh, and Yahweh tells him, well, have each of the chiefs of the tribe of Israel make a rod with the name of the tribe inscribed on it, bring it into the tent where you speak to me, and then see what happens. And then next morning, Moses goes into the temple, or the tent where he speaks to God, which is the equivalent of a temple, carries out these rods of wood, and one of them has borne leaves and a fruit, and this is a prefiguration of the birth of Jesus in medieval terms. So it's hope that has come, and redemption that has come into which is suggested in this account. This extended metaphor has 6 elements in common with the biblical account. And for me, that it makes it impossible to discount that it is an influence from there. So, and it is a kenning, like the one is that refer to the myth of poetry. We have them in the beginning of Sonatorrek, but this one is referring to a biblical story. But I think that it's also important where this is in the poem. This is just when he starts speaking about his parents, when the grieving starts. The grieving starts is put in a position equivalent to the coming of Christ, or for the announcement of the coming of Christ, the possibility of redemption. And I think that this is very important to have this biblical reference here when he speaks of his mother and father, and the grieving can begin. So how well does Sonatorrek fit into the saga? So sometimes I feel like I'm a child doing a puzzle and trying to force the piece into the wrong place, you know. And but I think that that Sonatorrek fits very well in the saga, and also in the reading I'm proposing of the saga. So there are 2 sons, 2 princes killed by Feldulfur and Skallagrimur, echoes in the drowning of Böðvar. There's the conflict with the father. There's the fact that the daughter, by tricking her father into drinking milk, is saving his soul in Christian terms. He's not only saving his life, but he's also saving his soul. Because, of course, dying of despair is a cardinal sin. You're sinning against one of the theological virtues. So the question is, does the experience change Egil? Has Egil changed through this experience of wanting to die and then retrieving again his will to live through poetry? And this brings us to psychoanalysis and the unconscious in literature. So Sigmund Freud said that dreams show and hide at the same time. The unconscious expresses itself in dreams, but also in other ways. Jacques Lacan, a continuator of Freud, said that the unconscious expresses itself like a language, that you have to understand that the unconscious is expressing itself in symptoms, in slips of the tongue. Of course, Freud had already shown that, in literary works as well, without the author being conscious of it. And Julia Kristeva, French-Bulgarian psychoanalyst and literary theorist, worked from Lacan, from Freud, but also from Melanie Klein, Hungarian psychoanalyst. Well, anyway, I think she was Hungarian. Melanie Klein, who most of her career was in England, she said that Melanie Klein was interested in what happens before language, before the Oedipus complex, before submitting to the law and so on. And she was interested in pre-Oedipal symbolization. So what acquires meaning before language, and was a trailblazer in the psychoanalysis of infants. Lacan was very interested in language as material, something to work on. And Julia Kristeva brings all of this together in studying the sensory experience in poetic language, how repetition of the rhymes, how the rhythms of poetry, how the sensory evocations of in poetry speak to the unconscious, and in a way that is beyond language or under language. And she developed a concept which she borrowed from Plato, called the Chora. So in Plato, it is the place of unformed ideas. That's where the Chora is. And so it's pre-linguistic in a way. Or that's how Kristeva is using it. And it's derived from a word, ancient Greek word for womb. So we are in a secluded space, like the bed closet, in close proximity to a maternal figure, like Egil with his daughter Þorgerður, who has the name of his wet nurse. And the Chora is in many ways pre-Oedipal. It's before the crisis of the Oedipus complex, but we all have this pre-Oedipus in us in one way or another, even though it is repressed. And so it's before entry into the symbolic, dominated by the father's law. And the Chora is dominated by sensory experience, by rhythm, by touch, by smell, by taste. And it is linked to play, imagination, freedom from constraints. And Lacan, in his reworking of Freudian theory, talked about three orders of consciousness that we all share, and we can shift from one to the other. One is the symbolic, when we express ourselves using language and so on, and in ways that that society tells us is the way to express ourselves. There's the real, in Lacan's sense, which is the unconscious, that which we cannot access through language. And then in between is the imaginary order, and that is linked to this Chora that Kristeva conceptualizes. And she said that the Chora also is the experience, that the infant's proximity to the basic drives, to the life drives, to the death drives. So what is happening in the bed closet, that where Egil composes his life-saving poem? So it's a secluded space, and it begins with isolation, the will to die, the repressed anger, and there's a denegation, which is also a suggestion of incest. There's the life-giving milk. There's a rage of that Egil bites the horn. It's the four stanzas about the difficulty in expressing oneself and the impossibility of grief, until he mentions before. So it's this fifth stanza, which I think is a key moment in the poem. He speaks about his móðurhrör, and then föður fall. And then comes the extended metaphor with the reference to the Bible. So föður fall, death of the father. So he mentions before he mentions the death of the father, he mentions the body of the mother. Hrör means a dead body. So he evokes in the poem two elements of the Oedipal kind of drama: the proximity with the mother's body, which is stopped or interrupted by the law of the father, the presence of the father. So if the father dies, the proximity to the mother and the possibility of returning to the pre-Oedipal stage, reconnecting with maybe the life drives, becomes possible. And I think that to have these two elements, of course, it's the dead body of the mother, but nevertheless, he is in the secluded space with this feminine presence of his own daughter, and the incestuous denegation, but at the same time suggestion, also puts us into this Oedipal context. So is this a is the poem a post-traumatic reconstruction of the self? So here are Lacan's three orders, and the imaginary and its links is very much linked to what Lacan says is the beginning of the construction of the self, which takes place in the mirror stage when the child starts to recognize itself in the mirror. It is an important event because it is the beginning of the construction of the self of the child. And it's an important moment. And we maybe all do that. This morning I woke up, took a shower, and discovered that I had forgotten to take my hairbrush with me. And my hair was all like this, and I stood before the mirror and I did like this, and I said, oh, okay. I reconstructed myself. And I think that poem in language, in our relationship to language, and especially in the creative relationship with language, is a reconstruction of the self. And this is what Ayed, or the author, is telling us is happening in this event, that Ayed is reconstructing himself. He presents himself as a son, as a father, as a brother, and as a poet at the end. And he is going through his identity. And at the end, he is no longer sad. And he awaits death with goodwill. And so by composing the poem, he has recomposed his self. And this leads to the ability to repair relationships. We are told that his surviving son, that he doesn't like him, and they have problems, in their relationship. But at the end of the saga, we have a long narrative about how Thorsteinn has problems with his neighbors, and Egill has moved away but comes back to help him to resolve these problems, and their relationship is restored or repaired. So if the story of Egill is about his conflictual relationship with his father, it is important to note that the last narrative in the saga is about how he repairs his relationship with his surviving son, Thorsteinn. So poetry has changed Egill. So what happened in the bed closet? Poetry, language repaired the irreparable loss of sons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very fascinating talk.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you so much for one of the last slides that you actually managed to show that the poem helped in this healing process.
Yes.
That was a very also wonderful presentation of keeping us excited to hear your conclusion.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, thank you.
So
nobody fell asleep.
So that was really very, very interesting. And we do have time because we have a long lunch break. So I think we should allow for questions. And I must say that at the very general level here, I think you managed to argue a very important change of how to look at sagas.
Yeah.
That all these conflicts, they are not about power, but a survival strategy at the personal level. I think that is very, very interesting. And that's actually a very new take on the sagas. And if we could read sagas and the conflicts, this aspect of revenge in the sagas, exactly as something that is going on at a personal level. It's not about, power and as very often.
It's psychological in a way. It's psychological survival.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then also a very fascinating reading of Egil Saga. I really like that idea of Skallagrim coming back from the mound, which fits neatly with what is going on with mounds in other sagas. So thank you so much. I have a few questions that I would like to talk, but I think I will allow others to do that first, and then we'll see how much time we have.
I would say just to the people.
There's somebody chatting.
Oh, someone in the chat?
No, it's just good morning. I can
okay. Okay.
Uh-huh.
So just if anyone wants to ask from there, just please unmute yourselves because we not necessarily see the we won't necessarily see the chat.
Okay, but we'll start with a question from the audience from you, Agnes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Torfi. Once upon a time, we were trying to speak French.
Yes, that's right.
English.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much. I've always been very fond of Sonatorrek, and I've used it.
Yes.
And I'm very happy to get all your expression about it. Egil is very sad when he's dying, so I'm not sure as we know, he was very sad. He was not very happy, old man. He was traveling around in the kitchen with some women. He was blind. So,
complaining about his impotence. Yes. Yes. Yes.
I want to also have a comment on Flugumýrabrennu.
Yes.
Because I think that was very good. You took it up because there is an author, Sturla Þórðarson.
Yes, the author. Yes. Yes.
His daughter is one of the who is said.
Yes.
In the. But he is also expressing a lot of this kind of, as you were saying in the Sonatorrek. How Sturla expressed the grief of Gissur.
Yes.
Because that's very literary, and I'm so happy about Úlfar because he always tells us that Sturlunga Saga is a literature.
Yes.
But he expressed Gissur comes with a priest of his wife.
Yes.
That's a very hagiographical. And he was crying. It was hot.
Yes.
Remember?
It's very literary, that hail coming from his eyes. Yes.
So this is also a question.
Yes.
You said that you think psychoanalysis is very even more relevant for pre-modern society.
Yes.
Can you explain it a little bit?
Well, I think that that when you are studying an author who's writing after Freud, you have to take into account that he is aware of Freud. So he might be playing with the Freudian concepts and so on, and might be trying to avoid falling into the trap of, he wouldn't name a character who is obviously in conflict with his father. He wouldn't name the first victim of that character with the same name as the father, as the author of Egil Saga does. The first victim, the first person Egil kills is Grímur, the little boy Grímur, and so no post-Freudian author would fall into that trap. But a pre-Freudian author, he doesn't know about the unconscious, but he feels it. He understands it in himself in a way, and expressing it through literature. So in a way, the fact that Grímur, that the first person killed by Egil is named Grímur, is the equivalent of a slip of the tongue. Yes, the unconscious is speaking, and it's interesting that there are other sagas where there is a conflictual relationship between father and son, and where the son kills the namesake of his father. It's Hallfreðar Saga. The first person that Hallfreðar kills when he comes to Norway is named Ottar, which is not a very common name. So that's what I mean, that the awareness of the Freudian theories kind of changes the relationship. And so I think I've answered there. Yes.
I want to pick up, this is just an example of what I said earlier, of how Torfi has this thing that he kind of, reverse engineers the past into Freudian, like he uses the Freudian theory kind of, in a way, almost showing the validity, but very much, of the psychoanalysis by showing its manifestation in a society that didn't have these concepts yet. So that's something that, thank you for that.
There's a question also from Jakob, and
Yes.
we will have that, and then I look if there is any questions.
Yeah. I'm monitoring it,
You are
so
monitoring it.
nobody is raising their hands.
Excellent.
You
So-
can do that electronically. I'm sure everybody knows how to use Zoom now.
Yes, that's true. So,
After
if you
COVID,
can
yeah.
keep an eye on that,
Yeah,
because
yes,
I
I will.
can't see it from here. Excellent. So, Jakob, please.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the lecture, and also thank you very much for this short but I think very important reference to Hatfield saga, because
Yes.
it was supposed to be part of my comment and question
Okay.
thing, because
Yeah.
your talk remind me how close both sagas are.
Yeah. Mhm.
And my rhetorical question somehow referring to this similarities between those two texts is that the Sonatorrek episode is more about the power of poetry,
Yes.
or perhaps more power of the father and son connection,
Yes.
rather
Yes.
than both. Like the Egil is able to revive only when he's able to compose poetry. The same way Alfred is able to kind of accept the loss of his patron, Olaf when he composes the Erfidraupa, in spite of the differences between those texts, that Alfred attempted to avenge the king. His awareness is no longer able to avenge his son. So, do you think it's like that we needed a poem here to make the Egil's revival complete, not only as a father, but as a character who is mainly known for his poetry composed already by the age of 3?
Well, there are so many things that come to mind. First of all, I think that Egil saga is a celebration of poetry. It is, the saga itself is a celebration of poetry. And I remember an old man I know who is not at all in the field, but is very well versed in kind of the sagas and so on. He says Snorri wrote about how to make poetry, the Edda. He used poetry to write the history of Norway, Heimskringla, and then he wrote. He's a believer, like many, that Snorri composed Egil saga too. Then he composed Egil saga to celebrate poetry. Yes, and I think that's I think Egil saga. So, but back to Hallfreðar saga. So I think that many years ago, Marianne Kalinke wrote an article about Hallfreðar saga called Stærek Brak, and it's she's arguing that there's a spiritual paternity, and so if Egil finds relief from his conflict with his father through poetry, Hallfreðar finds it through his love of Ólafur Tryggvason. Yes.
And moreover, what those two episodes have in common is this reaction on hearing about the death of the beloved person.
Yeah, exactly.
Similarly to
he wants to die.
He lies in bed and it looks like he's going to die.
Yes.
Instead, despite the fact that he's just about to have a duel.
Take
his honor. Not able
and
to...
only Greece understands him.
Listening to you, I was more and more convinced how close this sagas in certain ways are.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I have to think more about that. But yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. This was not only wonderfully presented and very thought-provoking, but I would also say quite emotional. So thank you very much. Putting us on this very emotional path, which I think is important, in discussing trauma, and in many ways. Well, I have a number of points and observations, some of which are, could be worked into questions, but I particularly appreciate, the your focus on the idea of, the recurrence of the name of kettle, like a receptacle.
Yes.
People are.
Yes.
We carry meanings, obviously, or we carry trauma. It's in the receptacle that is repeated. And also this idea of kind of variation that you spoke of, variation as a sort of poetic technique is sort of, reworking a motive and, giving us a different angle, but also variation in the lives of the saga characters, how they are sort of recurrent and repeated. But it's also little details is that you mentioned is that were fascinating. And I'm thinking of what Pernille said, by meaning to say I refuse sadness, is I refuse snowfall.
Yes, in the stanza by Gissur, yes. I refuse snowfall.
This kind of, whether these sort of little details is like I don't know, let's say weather-oriented details. In relation to storm and drowning is of suns also, or the snowfall is. And the snowfall in terms of trauma, I suppose we can already see a number of, or sadness and trauma, you can already see how snowfall works. The idea of a snowfall covering, but at the same time there's something underneath, and so on and so forth. I wonder whether you like to approach this from a kind of psychoanalytical perspective.
I haven't thought of that. Yes.
Way, but this is fascinating.
But the verses by Gissur Þorvaldsson, so it's not in Ailsa, but in this story, this chronicle composed by Snorri Sturluson's nephew, Sturla Þórðarson, and these verses are really good. Gissur Þorvaldsson was a really good poet. We only have 3 stanzas preserved by him, but he has, these 2 are really very, very good. And
in some respects, like haiku, sort of, you guys sort of stung by an image that erupts into a whole range of emotional senses.
Yes, but it's true that when he says hafnak muggu, so I separate myself, or I don't want snowfall. We have to interpret it, and it's a common interpretation that he is saying, I don't want to feel bad anymore, I don't want to be depressed anymore, and it's Sturla, as Agnes was saying, he is himself traumatized by this event. His daughter was almost killed, and she's actually saved by the man, the Kolbet, who went into the fire to go retrieve his cousin's daughter. He is the one who was killed by Sturla, by Gissur. So Sturla is obviously, and he talks about how the psychological effects of the event on his daughter. So he obviously was traumatized in a way, vicariously, by what had happened, but he's very interested in Sturla, in Gissur, and he's fascinated by Gissur. You can see it throughout. I'm sure Agnes agrees with me that he is fascinated by Gissur. When he describes Gissur the first time, it is at a wedding feast, I think, and the children of Þorvaldur are being presented to Sighvatur, Snorri Sturluson's brother, and when so he has many children, but he then brings the youngest, which is Gissur, and he says, "This is the one I love the most," and he holds him. So he describes. So Sturla Þórðarson describes Gissur as being much loved by his father. Then after the event of the burning, he talks about Gissur's resilience, the fact that he never showed, and except the hail coming from his eyes when witnessing the carrying out of the bodies, he never showed. He's in good spirits and nice to people and so on, but then when he has killed 6 men and not anybody, of a sufficient high social rank to make the revenge really, effective, he's shown as very irritable, and then he after killing Kolbeinn, he feels better. So he's interested in the emotions that Gissur is going through, because probably they resonate with his own. Yeah.
I think it's kind of therapeutic. I don't think there's any way of, I don't know, telling or judging, you know, to what an extent, you know, the sort of public or, I don't know, family readings of sagas would work as sort of therapy for family problems, you know, that we're sort of experiencing that. But I suppose we could, you know, hypothesize about this.
Yeah, that might be, yeah. I think there is a therapeutic value to literature, yes.
Yoav, is it okay that I have just a few quick questions before we?
I think half an hour to eat.
Yeah, all right. So we will have
so like 8 more minutes.
yes, and yes. So about this idea of Egil Saga being a constructed literary work, piece of art, I agree about that.
Yes.
And I have two questions in that regard that can perhaps nuance them or add to what you have suggested. And the first thing is about these structural repetitions that you mentioned, and which there are indeed a lot of, and you show them in very many details. The use of a kettle or the drowning of young men. And they provide meaning by change of details, but they are still recognizable as a repetition. I wonder, and perhaps that's my own focus on memory that comes in here, but I wonder if these literary devices, as you talk about, can also be seen as mnemonic devices. And because here you have the same idea about repetitions, about changing of small details, but and perhaps they would, and that does not take away the idea of this as a constructed work, but it relates perhaps more to how it was constructed at a time where people were thinking both in oral ways of telling narratives and in literary ways. So I just wonder if you could see that there could be an addition to that, that it's not only to nail down the textual status of the text, but that it might also reflect on mnemonic and oral composition of narrative. So that was,
I think it's a very interesting, and I mean, you have showed us so much and taught us so much about mnemonic echoings in your latest book and so on. And I think that, and I have in myself made the experience of learning Skaldic poetry by heart. And I can recite for you Höfuðlausn if you want. Yes. And and how do you do that? You do that by finding repetitions. The repetitions help you to remember, and so on. The structural things like the in Höfuðlausn you have the 4 shorter. I don't remember the technical term for it. The 4 shorter stanzas and so on. All of this helps. And I think that, though I do believe that Egil Saga was composed in a literate culture, I think it was a literate culture like you have shown us, which is very much shaped by the practice of poetry and the practice of learning by heart and using all kinds of techniques, like structural techniques, to remember. So even though the saga was composed, probably written down as it was composed, I think that and this is what I said, I think that the author has what I call a Skaldic mindset. So he thinks in terms of Skaldic poetry. That's why there's this possibility of playing with language, playing with double meaning, of creating kind of kennings and so on. I think that in the same way, so I've never thought of that. I think that he uses mnemonic devices in his compositional techniques.
I like that idea of having that combined into the literary culture.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So that was one thing I was wondering. And another thing is that on your slide where you reflect on when was this poem composed? Was it Egil in the past? Was it at the time of the saga? And I think you referred to the 13th century and perhaps indicated that it could be Snorri. You didn't say so, I don't know. But it might have.
I don't know.
No, but I thought perhaps an addition to that. And that doesn't take away the idea of the saga as a constructed saga. Could it have been someone at a later stage of transmission?
Somebody?
At a later stage of
after the saga was composed?
Yes. After the saga was composed and when the manuscripts were being written,
Yes.
that somebody there read the saga so carefully
Yeah.
and then added to those fragments of the poem and made a nice poem that fitted into the saga. I just wanted to say that to take in manuscript transmission and to take that seriously. Perhaps actually it might have been, now I don't remember when the poem, how late we have the full poem.
This is an interesting theory.
Something like that. I mean, but technically, it could not only be back in time, but at the time of the saga, but
afterwards, yes.
It could have been afterwards.
Many thoughts about this. Yeah. First of all, the unconscious if you're looking for the unconscious and how it works in a literary text, it is not necessarily only the unconscious of one individual. It can also be, I mean, we communicate unconsciously, and the structures discovered by psychoanalysis are shared by people. And you can recognize unconsciously the unconscious of another sometimes in work. So your idea of the poem being composed afterwards, after the story, by somebody who understands what is going on and expresses it in his way, it works. But but the Snorri quotes Sonatorrek in the Edda.
Yes, that's true.
Yes, and
quotes it, but not the full poem.
Not the full poem, but one or two kennings, yes.
Yeah, no. The idea or the suggestion is more like somebody knew fragments.
Yeah.
And that the poem had existed. I mean, not inventing the idea of that poem, but simply added to it and gave it more volume.
Exactly, or recomposed it. Yeah, recomposed it. No, I think that anything is possible in that sense. So I used to be, very strongly in favor of a 12th or 13th century composition of Sonatorrek. And I point to the fact that the saga kind of constructs Egil as a pre-Christian noble, a bit, who would have the same status as Old Testament people. And many of the episodes in Egil's lives refer to King David and the loss of the son, for example, and the loss through illness of the son. Yes, and then but there's this very exceptional, deep personal expression in Egil's, which makes it so difficult to believe that it is from the 10th century. And I came across the fact that in the 12th century, the philosopher Abelard composed poetry, Planctusis, in Latin, in the name On Grief, On Loss, very personal poem, but where he placed the poetry in the mouths of characters from the Old Testament. So that could be a model for somebody who wanted to compose Sonatorrek instead of Egil or in Egil's name. Yes, yes, but
I think we will